we ballyhooly Hollywood, where any office boy or young mechanic can be a panic.
Welcome back to The Place of Places, a chapter-by-chapter analysis of William Saroyan's 1972 memoir, Places Where I've Done Time. Today, we check into the Gilbert Hotel, Hollywood, 1933. This chapter focuses on Saroyan's first days in Hollywood. In his 20s, he would spend weeks or months living in Hollywood, soliciting his ideas for movies, also known as scenarios. In I Used to Believe I Had Forever, Now I'm Not So Sure, he writes, "In the language of Hollywood, such a story is an outline. An outline is simple enough and short enough for even the biggest man at the studio to read and understand. From the outline, a deal is made for the writing of the scenario, or shooting script. Nobody took the outlines I wrote seriously." Even the idea for a movie could sell for $5,000 at that time. Around this time, a couple of Hollywood agents had sent me telegrams from time to time saying they had easy work for me with good pay at one or another of the movie factories. So Saroyan would make the drive from San Francisco to Hollywood and try writing for the glamorous movie industry. He got to know many writers there. Some were already committed to the screenwriting profession, and others were novelists who dabbled in screenwriting for the fast money. Writing a film was usually better money than getting published in magazines, and much faster than writing a book. In obituaries, he wrote of 1930s Hollywood, "Anybody who said he was a writer and could talk big, he was a writer." We've broached this time period before, notably at Stanley Rose's bookshop. In that chapter and this one, he mentions his friend John Fonte, who made a career of screenwriting with novels as secondary projects. At this time, 1933, Stanley Rose was beginning to endorse Saroyan and would soon sell autographed copies of Story magazine, where Saroyan was published. Saroyan had already been published in Overland Monthly in 1928, and this gave him confidence to seek writing jobs anywhere. But he really fixates in this chapter on the writer Jim Tully. He tells us Tully was staying at the Mark Twain Hotel, run down even in 1933. It was down the street from the Gilbert Hotel, where Saroyan was staying. He tells us that he was staying at the Gilbert because it was less depressing than the Mark Twain, and the same price. Both were built in the mid-1920s, and both had offered single occupancy rooms on the cheap. By the 1930s, the Mark Twain was already widely known as a flophouse. The hotels are between Sunset Boulevard and Hollywood Boulevard, which historically has alternated between trendy and trashy from decade to decade. In the 1970s, Tom Waits sang about the Gilbert Hotel being little better than a bus stop. But it was certainly central to the movie business in the 1930s, so there's no doubt that young actors and writers on a budget would have flocked there. In 2014, the Gilbert Hotel was converted into student housing for the American Musical and Dramatic Academy College of the Performing Arts. So it seems only right that Saroyan stayed there as a young dramatist, and it went full circle, for our purposes. Saroyan got to know Jim Tully when they ran into each other on Wilcox Avenue, and would sometimes grab a beer on Hollywood Boulevard. He concluded that Tully knew everybody in Hollywood well enough to despise them. He says Tully complained that Charlie Chaplin stole his writing, Hemingway stole his style, and John Gilbert didn't like what he had to say about him in Vanity Fair, so Tully broke a bottle over his head. Who was Jim Tully? Saroyan tells us he was a professional hobo, having spent a number of years traveling the country by railroad. Short, thick, broad-shouldered, with red, abundant hair and small hands and feet. Tully was born in Ohio in 1886 to Irish immigrant parents. After his mother died, his father sent him to live in an orphanage for 6 years, and he didn't complete school, opting for the vagabond life instead. In 1912, he moved to Hollywood and began reporting on celebrities as a freelancer with strong opinions, earning him the title of Most Hated Man in Hollywood. But he also wrote books, semi-memoirs like Saroyan, and notably featuring gritty topics like prostitution and boxing. With this background, it's no wonder Saroyan was intrigued by the man 25 years his senior. Screenwriter Rupert Hayes wrote of him, "Tully has fathered the school of hard-boiled writing so zealously cultivated by Ernest Hemingway and lesser luminaries." This style of fiction also would have appealed to young Saroyan, who famously insulted Hemingway in his story 70,000 Assyrians, prompting a decades-long feud with Papa Hemingway, and earnest denial that he in any way was influenced by Hemingway. Tully and Hemingway were more contemporaries, and Saroyan says Tully told him that the short staccato sentence was my discovery. I used it in my articles in Vanity Fair and in 3 novels before Hemingway was published. Saroyan explains, Jim Tully never suspected that it may not have been the short staccato sentence that was at the bottom of Mr. Hemingway's great appeal, not just to English-speaking peoples, but to readers all over the world. Saroyan had a grudging respect for Hemingway as a writer, but there is extensive published evidence that he didn't like him much as a man. And he insisted that earlier writer Sherwood Anderson predated Hemingway in the modern terse style of writing that today is widely attributed to Hemingway. Tully became famous for his memoir Beggars of Life, which became a 1928 movie. He wrote a dozen books from 1922 to 1942, some of them well regarded as they delved into hard-knock lives, though his career was already in decline in the mid to late 1930s. He admired Mark Twain and Jack London, the latter as a fellow boxcar traveler. This may be the reason he was staying at the Mark Twain Hotel in 1933. Tully's career tanked in the 1940s, and he fell into relative obscurity, dying in 1947. This chapter is a little bit of homage to Saroyan's fellow writers, to the ones who made it big and then fizzled, and to the ones who just kept working, never to find fame and fortune. He seemingly randomly jumps ahead in time to 1966 to connect Ilya Ehrenberg to the story, who apparently also had curiously small hands, like Jim Tully. Ehrenberg was a Soviet-era poet and journalist, known to be patriotic towards Russia and fiercely anti-German, as a Russian communist Jew. Saroyan references Ehrenberg's memoir, which was of interest for many reasons. This was People, Years, Life, which goes into some detail of life as an intellectual in Stalin's USSR. And why does Saroyan start with Tully and then move on to Ehrenberg and Hemingway and their dramatic life stories, finding their way to the middle of huge European events? Well, Saroyan too found himself in the middle of big European events during World War II, and he hated it. He felt he had no reason to be there, involved with something he had no interest in and no passion to fight for. To him, Jim Tully had the good life, allowed to keep his head down and write about his small corner of the world. But Ehrenberg and Hemingway got the legacy. They were icons, but he puts them in stark contrast to Tully, who really was more his speed. Saroyan prided himself on never selling out or even choosing the business aspect of writing over the writing itself. He was proud of his constant output, proud of how fast he could write a book, and proud that he never had to make money in any way other than writing after 1934. He ends this chapter, "At the Gilbert Hotel, a published writer at last, I marveled how much like everybody else the writers were that I knew. Joe Pagano, Owen Francis, John Fante, Horace McCoy, and a good dozen or more others." Joe Pagano was the son of Italian immigrants in Denver, just like John Fante. Pagano was a screenwriter for 30 years. Owen Francis was another career screenwriter. Horace McCoy was an actor, screenwriter, and novelist with a long career in Hollywood. Lastly, Saroyan mentions William Rollins Jr., who he claims published only one book and then disappeared. Rollins actually wrote several books and was part of the hard-boiled noir fiction movement that was sweeping the country in the 1930s and 1940s. The fact is, most writers don't get to be famous, and most of the men he lists at the end of this chapter don't have portraits online today to drive that home. This chapter is a salute to those working professionals who do it for the love and for the money, but certainly not for the prestige. Let's put this on the Saroyan map and move on.